After completing the electrical system in the previous episode, we left on a cliffhanger about the vacuum system, so that's what we'll be starting today. The reason we need to hook up any vacuum lines at all is that the new internal airbox utilizes vacuum to open and close the diverter doors, whereas the original airbox utilized cables. This allows for a lot less effort for the user when changing vents, and prevents issues of cables falling off when they get old and don't slide as freely as they once did. Unfortunately, this car was not equipped with air conditioning or cruise control, meaning the vacuum source on the intake manifold is simply plugged. In order to plumb our vacuum system, we're going to need a few parts. First of all, we need a fitting that screws into the intake manifold and has a connection for a 1/4 inch vacuum line. Second, we'll need a check valve that will allow vacuum to pass, but will not release it if the source of vacuum changes. The check valve will then have two connections. One will be to the heater controls, to control the vents. The other will be to the vacuum reservoir. The reservoir allows vacuum to be stored and works with the check valve to ensure that the vents will continue to operate even when the engine's vacuum is low. With everything in hand, the first step is to remove the plug in the intake manifold. This uses a square head, which makes it a little awkward to remove. Once removed, the new fitting can be screwed into place. It should be noted that thread sealer would be a good idea, and I came back and added some later. Unfortunately, the EGR valve ended up being in the way of screwing the fitting down more thoroughly, as the nipple contacted it.
Is it hitting? It's hitting this, isn't it? Right there. I can't see, but it doesn't want to spin.
It's close, yeah, it is hitting that. It's not spinning.
Let's just back it off a little. And I think I'll just call that good enough.
Because these are NPT tapered threads, combined with thread sealer, it should be okay. However, if there are any vacuum leaks in the future, this will be our starting point. Now that the fitting is installed, a small section of 1/4 inch vacuum line can be connected between the fitting and the check valve. Once connected to the fitting, the vacuum source from the heater controls can then be connected to the check valve as well.
Is this how easy it is? Aw. Jinxed it.
Needs to go on. I think that's good.
Is the bottom yeah?
That should be fine.
Nice. That's not sitting in a horrible position either.
No, this will all get covered by the big air intake too.
Yeah.
The vacuum line from the heater controls that is meant to go to the heater valve is then plugged, as we opted not to install a heater valve. Next, a 1/8 inch vacuum line can be connected to the other port on the check valve, which will then be connected to the vacuum reservoir. It should be noted that I am using a 1/8 inch fuel line here, as that is what my parts store had in stock. For testing purposes, we just connected the other end to the vacuum reservoir and laid it in a safe spot in the engine bay. Our vacuum reservoir was a universal part and had 2 ports on it, so I went ahead and plugged the other end with a vacuum cap. We then ran the engine to test the operation of the airbox doors. It should be noted that the engine had no coolant in it, and we only ran it for a short time. With the engine running, the doors could be seen opening and closing, so we knew everything was working correctly.
Other than it being super slow, is that okay?
I think it's fine. I haven't seen this one move.
Ah.
Oh wait, no, hold on. No, it did move. It's not this one. Yeah, we're good.
Alright.
The factory vacuum reservoir was mounted in the passenger side fender. However, because we were using a universal part, we decided to mount it in an easier to reach location near the relays on the firewall. To do this, we had to extend the notch on one of the mounting ears. However, once done, it could be securely mounted using a nut and a bolt. Now that the reservoir is resting in its home, the vacuum line can be run as clean as possible along the firewall and cut to length, before being connected to the reservoir for good.
Okay. I'm happy with that.
That's looking good.
Well, today we're back and we have one objective. Installing those. The first thing we did with the condenser is test fit it into its new home. At this time, I had no idea how it was supposed to mount, so I took some time to look around at how it fit into the space, as well as how it fit with the radiator installed. After some research, I ended up ordering the correct mounts from a website called 3rd Gen Bargain Barn. They have loads of used 3rd Gen parts, and luckily they had exactly what I needed. After ponying up the shipping cost to Canada, and waiting around 2 weeks, we finally had the correct mounts to put everything together. Before we can mount the condenser permanently, we need to first clean and fix it. This condenser was in pretty rough shape, but given all the other parts were so untested, I decided I would try and use it for the time being, and replace it in the future if needed, maybe with an upgraded parallel flow model. Regardless, I had to spend some time straightening out the fins to hopefully allow air to pass through it. A clogged condenser wouldn't only affect the air conditioning system, but also the cooling system, as it would block airflow to the radiator as well. With the condenser as repaired as I could get it, it was time to mount it into the car. First I installed the lower condenser/radiator mounts into the car, before installing the upper mounts onto the condenser. The condenser could then be slipped into the engine bay, carefully resting it into the lower mounts on the radiator support and pulling the tabs on the upper mounts to lock them into place in the car. Now that the condenser is secured into its mount, the radiator can easily be installed in front of it. After carefully lifting it over the condenser, it can be slid into the rubber mounts at the bottom, being very careful not to damage the condenser fins on its way down. This is likely how some of the damage occurred to the condenser when it was removed from the donor car. The radiator hoses are then reconnected one by one, including the lower radiator hose, the heater hose, the overflow tank, as well as the upper radiator hose. I then gave the top of the radiator a quick cleaning before securing it back down to the car with its plastic radiator mount. With the mount in place, we can then reinstall the 4 screws securing it to the body. The last thing to be put back to complete the cooling system is the radiator fan. With the plastic shroud in place, the fan slips behind the radiator and can be reinstalled using the 4 screws. Once fully fastened, don't forget to reconnect the electrical connector. It is finally time to complete the plumbing for the air conditioning system. The bracket for the dryer receiver and the hardline were installed first. The hardline runs along the passenger side frame rail near the heater hardline and connects to the evaporator next to the airbox. Once attached, the other end can be connected to the lower port on the condenser. Please note, this is a great time to replace your O-rings. In my case, this project occurred in January, and I would not need the AC to be functional for several months, so I opted to come back and replace the O-rings, as well as a few other components such as the compressor and the dryer receiver later. This will be covered on the next episode. I next swapped out the idler pulley for the air conditioning compressor. Again, I plan to replace the compressor in the future, as these R4 units are known to leak, and this one appears to have blown its seals. That being said, I won't be throwing it away, as it's an original Harrison unit, and if you have the tools to replace the seals, that is a very good alternative to a new unit of questionable quality. The process involves removing the serpentine belt by loosening the tensioner, then removing the 3 fasteners around the back of the idler pulley. One of these also attaches to the pulley brace, so that must be removed as well. Once the idler is removed, the air conditioning compressor simply slides into place, and installation is the reverse of removal. There are 3 bolts and a support brace that ties into the exhaust manifold studs. Now the rubber air conditioning lines, as well as the dryer receiver, can be installed. I never disconnected the dry receiver from the lines, so I'll be installing them as a unit. The dry receiver attaches to the evaporator, and the lines connect both to the compressor using the integrated manifold and into the top connection on the condenser. And that's that. All of the engine bay air conditioning components are finally installed. The next task at hand is to reinstall the dashboard. This was more complicated than it needed to be, as I opted to do my best to repair some cracks that had formed in the plastic. The most concerning of which were the cracks in one of the bolt holes that secures the dashboard to the body of the car. I began by using cardboard to make a template of the dash. Using the template, I transferred the shape I needed onto some scrap metal and made my cut. Mocking up the piece on the dash allowed me to outline the hole to be made with a Sharpie. Then, using a combination of a drill and a Dremel, I created a hole in the piece of the sheet metal that mirrored the one on the dash. Finally, the piece of metal could be glued into place to finalize the repair. Another concerning part was this large crack near the center of the dash. I decided to use a large piece of sheet metal formed to the shape of the dash and glued it in place to reinforce the surrounding area and hopefully stop the crack in its traces. The next hurdle was a bit of an unexpected one. This is the in-dashboard ducting, and it turns out that one of the openings in the air conditioning airbox is bigger than those on the non-air conditioning airbox, meaning that the ducting won't connect properly. The solution? Cardboard-aided design, of course. Using a cardboard template, we simply cut a piece of sheet metal to fill the gap and help seal the larger opening in the airbox against the original ducting. This also meant relocating some of the sealing foam, however this was easily solved with a little bit of hot glue. With all of our small modifications and repairs complete, the interior can be reassembled. I took my time and tried to manage the cables as tidy as possible. There's quite a bit of aftermarket wiring in this car, between the stereo, aftermarket power windows, and aftermarket power locks, as well as an alarm, so it's a great time to run these wires more neatly and make everything look as factory as possible. I also took the opportunity to hardwire my dash cam. That way the wires are hidden and it powers up with the key, meaning I won't kill my battery if I forget to unplug it anymore. As long as you kept your fasteners organized, everything should go back together relatively easily, as it's pretty much the reverse of removal. Love it or hate it, many of the screws that hold these Camaros together are visible, as they were used for cosmetics. However, that makes taking things apart and putting them back together a breeze. The crowning jewel in this whole reinstallation is the dash pad. It needs to be carefully slid into place, then its many fasteners can be gently secured. I by some miracle have an original uncracked dashboard, and to ensure it stays that way, I only gently snugged down the fasteners, giving the dash pad room to expand and contract in the heat. With the interior put back together, the last task to make the car drivable after its almost month-long hiatus at this point is to refill the coolant and bleed the system. I just used some generic pre-mixed antifreeze from the parts store, and for everyone wondering, it took around 2 bottles. We started the engine and let the system run with the radiator cap off to hopefully remove as many bubbles as possible. Because we didn't drain the engine block, there didn't seem to be too many air bubbles to deal with, so we simply topped up the system and let it run for a while. We did it! We have now reached what I call Phase 1 completion, and that the entire system is installed into the car, however we have yet to make it functional. This was a monumental achievement, as not only was this the most ambitious automotive project I had ever attempted, but we accomplished what some said would not be feasibly possible. This just goes to show that you shouldn't ever let a naysayer prevent you from attempting your projects, as with enough research, planning, and time, anything is possible. If you've made it this far into the video, first of all, thank you so much. If you enjoy the content I make, please consider dropping a like and subscribing, as it's your support that keeps me going. please join me on the next episode in this series, where we'll install new seals, a new compressor, and a new dry receiver, as well as take the car to a local shop to get the system charged, and finally make this air conditioning system functional.